The Australian journalist Donald Horne said, "Australia is a lucky country, run by second-rate people who share its luck." The phrase "the lucky country" is most frequently used to describe Australia's exceptional performance in terms of its economic output, its institutions, and its infrastructure and standard of living. However, Donald Horne had a more pessimistic tone. The full quote is, "Australia is a lucky country, mainly run by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas. And although its ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders in all fields lack curiosity about the events that surround them, but oftentimes are taken by surprise." What he meant is that Australia had inherited the British system of governance and society that made much of the success a given. This had made it a product of luck rather than vision, innovation, and creativity. Australia, nonetheless, is one of the most overlooked major economic powers in the field of international affairs and geopolitics. Its geographic isolation, relatively small population, and political stability has led many to ignore its influence on the world stage. Many books on geopolitics that split chapters by regions oftentimes skip Australia and the rest of Oceania altogether. And that's a shame because Australia is one of the top 20 largest economies in the world, with a very well-functioning government and a history of impressive military performance. The purpose of this video will be to assess Australia's potential to be a great power over the course of this century. Former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd described Australia as a middle power, a nation that clearly lacks superpower influence like the United States, or even great power status like the UK, France, Germany, Russia, or Japan, but nonetheless clearly holds respectable clout over the world stage. I also seek to help describe the psyche of Australia, if one can do that for a country that cannot be summarized purely by its landmass or economy or by its arms, but rather by the mindset of many of its citizens. Donald Horne, after all, did coin the term lucky country, but he is oftentimes misattributed with Geoffrey Blainey's book titled The Tyranny of Distance, as anyone who has looked at Australia on a world map can tell that they are very far away from just about anyone else. And that has led to a certain degree of stability and prosperity. Given the nation's sense of safety and security, while at the same time instilling a sense of Australia's being irrelevant on the world stage, secluded in one of the far-off corners of the world map, with only New Zealand and a few other island nations pulled into its orbit. Another source of Australia's self-doubt comes from its very young history, one that really starts during the 1700s, even younger than those of settlement nations in the Americas. This is in contrast to the ancient and medieval histories and cultures and lore stemming from much of Europe and Asia. However, Australia is still one of the oldest in terms of its geography, its physical geography, and due to its timescale and isolation. This led the continent to being home to some of the most amazing varieties of endemic flora and fauna, which has a massive impact on shaping Australian identity and iconography. The nation is also very old in terms of anthropology, as Australian Aboriginals and their successors are some of the oldest cultures on the planet. Nonetheless, the story of Australia as a modern nation-state is a young one, set up in a remote and marginal outpost of an upcoming superpower, the British Empire. The arrival of Captain Cook and successive British colonists led the near destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures on the continent. In the case of Tasmania, it meant the literal extinction of all purebred Aboriginals on the island. Most of you have heard of stories about Australia being used as a penal colony. This is true, but it's oftentimes misrepresented as a colony filled with serial killers and mass murderers. Most of the prisoners were by and large debt prisoners. Many were also Irish Catholics and others that the British elites thought were undesirable. This combination of a past as a penal colony, its remoteness, and the harsh realities of Australia's arid, vast landscape instilled a sense of rugged endurance and individualism. This abstract notion would be personified by the first Australian stock character, the bushranger, escaped convicts and hardy outlaws on the outskirts of society, which become romanticized as Australian identity signifiers, despite all the baggage. These colonies would adopt the political, legal, economic, militaristic, and legal customs of institutions of their mother nation, Britain. Britain at the time was arguably the pinnacle of civilization. It was far more stable, technologically advanced, and less corrupt than almost all of the powers of mainland Europe, let alone the rest of the world. These institutions would become the backbone of Australia's historical and modern success. The British also learned their lesson from the successful American Revolution and some unsuccessful revolutions in what are now Canada. So they allowed settlers in Australia more opportunity for self-rule. And unlike North America, the British territories were not in close contact with those of other European powers, which led to a smaller British military presence compared to that of North America, and later compared to that of many other parts of the empire such as India and Southeast Asia. And since most of the newcomers were white British settlers, they had the incentive to invest in the colony and to give the colonists expanded rights. This was in sharp contrast to non-white majority colonies like India and South Africa, where the primary purpose of the British was to extract as much resource as possible, with minimal amounts of compensation given to the native people. For this reason, Australians remained fairly loyal to Mother Britain, even after confederating during the early 20th century. New Zealand refused to join, damn Kiwis, and it was not until World War I when Australia would truly gain a strong sense of collective national identity, as it was the first time they fought under their own flag. Australian soldiers had participated in the Boer War in South Africa and other British imperial adventures. But the Battle of Gallipoli against the Ottoman Turks would solidify Australian national identity more than any other, as they were not actually fighting as British subjects but as Australians. The battle was a massive defeat for Australian soldiers, but a victory for the Australian psyche. The Ottoman Turks repelled the attack, but Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the modern Turkish nation, grew a great deal of fondness for the Australian soldiers. And he stated in this quote, "Those heroes who had shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly nation. Therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets. To us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours, you, the mothers who sent your sons to faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in the bosom, and we are at peace. Having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." To this day, Australia and Turkey actually have fairly good relations with each other, in part due to this shared history of fighting against each other, but still respecting each other nonetheless. Eventually, the Australians would be called again to fight for Mother Britain during World War II. At first, they fought in Europe, the Mediterranean, and North African theaters, but after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, the British and the Japanese empires went to war with each other. The Japanese quickly expanded their empire, taking over much of Southeast Asia, including Singapore, which was primarily defended by Australian soldiers. Australia, for the first time in its history, and really the only time in its history so far, was attacked on their own soil by a foreign military power. When the Japanese bombed Darwin and the Northern Territories, it was unlikely that the Japanese would start a full-scale invasion of Australia, but many Australian politicians considered ceding all the lands north of Brisbane to the Japanese. But, as the nickname suggests, the lucky country was under the protection of the United States. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first major battle in history directly involving aircraft carriers. It was the first time when a major Japanese advance was halted by the Allies. The Australians now knew that it was the United States, rather than the British Empire, that was the foremost naval power. The two nations would heavily collaborate across much of the Pacific, and Australia would play a pivotal role in the Papua New Guinea campaign. This was the turning point when the British had handed the baton to the United States as the most powerful liberal democracy, for better and for worse. Australia would be a key US ally during the Cold War, taking part in American-led interventions in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq again, and other conflicts. Over the years, there has been some concern regarding integrating Australian foreign policy too closely to that of the United States, particularly given the military quagmires of the War on Terror. But nonetheless, Australia is still a firm part of the American international order. Australia has also joined the US in the Five Eyes program, which is an intelligence alliance made up of 5 Anglosphere nations: the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. It was created as a bulwark against communism, but in recent years it has been embroiled in scandals involving mass surveillance of foreign governments and civilians. during the aftermath of World War II, Australia wanted to wash away its backwater image. It opened up to immigrants, got rid of its white-only immigration policy, and started to look for investment. It built a pretty house that you may have heard of, the Sydney Opera House, as a way of saying, hey, we're not just a bunch of bogans. So, moving on from that, let's move on to the country's geography. Australia, as you know, is a very isolated nation. The vast majority of the population resides in urban and suburban metropolitan areas, particularly on the east to southeast coast of the country. This area stretches from the subtropical climate to temperate climates. Its demographic, economic, and cultural nexus of the nation resides in this area. This area includes cities like the Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sydney, and the capital Canberra, along with Melbourne and Adelaide. The only major population centers worth mentioning outside of this area are lonely little Darwin and Perth. Much of the outskirts of these metropolitan areas are referred to as the bush. Densely populated East Coast areas are hugged by a Great Dividing Range, followed by a relatively rich pastoral land to the west. The rest of the country, however, is mostly composed of the outback, a harsh, arid desert wilderness that has played a large romanticized role in Australia's image, but provides very little in terms of use for permanent settlements. This is where much of the mineral wealth of the country resides, primarily in Western Australia. It's not that Australia is extraordinarily rich in mineral wealth, but rather that its large landmass, along with its recent history, made sure that vast deposits of minerals were previously untouched. The mineral wealth, along with Chinese demand, led to an economic boom in cities like Perth, but the boom eventually subsided, placing much of Western Australia in a state of relative economic decline. I had previously lived in Perth for a brief period of time after the mining boom, and it was kind of like the state was in a collective period of a hangover. While Australia is somewhat blessed by its geography, it also has one massive vulnerability. The country is very arid, and temperatures in the interior are brutally hot. While there are areas of Australia that do get a lot of precipitation, like the Daintree rainforest in northeast Queensland, most of the country is too dry for any long-term settlement. This is the main reason as to why the country is so sparsely populated, usually ranked as second or third most sparsely populated on the planet after Mongolia and Namibia. This prohibited Australia from becoming a superpower like the US did. Instead, Australian settlements fared far more similarly to that of Canada, as most of the population huddles a small habitable portion of a massive, largely uninhabitable country. The arid climate throughout much of the continent has also put enormous pressure on agriculture, mining operations, natural ecosystems, and population centers. It has also made the country highly susceptible to extreme wildfires. Despite these challenges inherent in the physical geography, Australia remains one of the undisputed regional powers of Oceania. Really, the only regional power. It shares a freedom of movement agreement with New Zealand, and many Kiwis frequently move to Australia because they have similar quality of life, but New Zealand's job market tends to provide lower wages, which leads to brain drain to Australia. Australia has also participated in military and diplomatic efforts in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. These impoverished nations are heavily dependent on Australian aid. However, there have been some concerns and accusations of Australia acting as a form of a neo-colonialist and some sort of quasi-imperialism. The most controversial relationship in the region is that with the tiny island nation of Nauru. Nauru is essentially a client state of Australia, and ever since the island's phosphate deposits were no longer profitable, Nauru went from being one of the world's richest to poorest nations in a matter of decades. Australia has been the main provider of aid, following the hangover. In return, Australia uses Nauru as a base for its controversial detention center, in which many refugees and other migrants have been held in inhumane conditions. In Southeast Asia to the north, Australia holds relations with another regional power, Indonesia. Australia and Indonesia hold very strong economic ties. However, there have been bumps regarding Australian spying operations and Indonesian war crimes during the 1999 East Timor conflict, of which Australia acted as a peacekeeping force. There have also been controversies over terrorist attacks in Bali, which killed primarily Australian citizens. Overall, Australia maintains relatively small, well-equipped military units, specifically in regards to its navy, given the status as an island nation, It also frequently collaborates in military training and operations with the United States. This has resulted in Australia getting involved in numerous military quagmires like Iraq. However, it also avoided other conflicts such as the 2011 NATO strikes in Libya. Let's move on to its economic power. Sure, we can talk about its military affairs, but at the end of the day, it's the money that really matters. Australia has one of the best-run banking systems and economic institutions in the world, with a stable currency and safe opportunities for investment. Australia has arguably had one of the longest periods of time without a recession. The first Gulf War in the early 1990s led to an increase in oil prices, which in part led to a recession in Australia. However, Australia was rather untouched for 30 years, not entering an official recession during the 2008 worldwide financial crisis. This long-term success story was only broken by the 2020 COVID pandemic, but even then, Australia handled the situation pretty well, in part due to its geographic isolation and sound social policy procedures. Overall, the country continues to enjoy an excellent standard of living and stability. This has attracted immigrants from all over the world, and Australia has moved from becoming a backwater, primarily Anglo-Celtic nation to a nation with one of the highest percentages of foreign-born people. On top of that, Australia, like the US, Canada, and other settler countries unlike Europe, is very good at assimilating immigrants. This influx of talent, along with a high rate of population growth for a developed nation, will make Australia a more serious player on the world stage in coming decades. However, there is one major concern: the coming bipolar world order potentially between the United States and China. Australia is a close strategic partner and diplomatic ally with the US, yet its largest trading partner is China. Australia knows that the future is moving away from the Atlantic into the Pacific, and there are a lot of opportunities, but Australian leaders are worried about China's increasing grip on the nation's economy. This trend will increase tensions, and Australia will choose between the United States, which relies on its protection, or China as the consumer of its exports. It is far more likely that Australia will remain loyal to the United States rather than China, as the two share not only strategic geopolitical agreements, but also a similar culture, civic society, language, and a firm belief in liberal democracy as opposed to the autocracy of China. Australia is currently part of the Quad, along with the US, Japan, and India, four democratic nations adamant on containing China's sphere of influence. While Australia's power projection will certainly improve drastically, it's unlikely to become a great power on the scale of, say, modern-day Russia or France. Its population is still too small. Its military, while powerful and punches above its weight, is still dependent on the United States. Its lack of a nuclear arsenal confines it to a middle power status in the modern day. It will probably stay that way for much of the 21st century. One exception scenario is Kanzuk, a hypothetical, political, or at the very least super-national union between Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and Canada. This national or supranational organization would be the largest in terms of landmass, stretching the globe, and would become one of the most prosperous on the planet, all holding the same or similar languages, institutions, and cultures. However, this would probably involve Australia giving up some of its sovereignty to larger players, namely the UK and to a much lesser extent Canada. The nation would also probably operate more similarly to the EU rather than one primary nation. This stretched out landmass and population would also mean that it would still be dependent on American naval protection, the same way that the EU is dependent on the American military and air force protection. The economic gravity is also an issue, as Canada holds more important trade ties with the US and Mexico than any of the Kanzuk nations. The UK holds stronger trade relations with the EU, despite the divorce. And Australia, despite all of its insecurities, trades more with, you guessed it, China. This makes it unlikely that Australia will become a great power in the coming decades, but there does remain a possibility that perhaps it will be in the 22nd century. Overall, the future looks very bright for Australia, and the lucky country has stood the test of time.